Dr. Zack Moir is an Associate Professor of Music and Director of the Applied Music Research Centre at Edinburgh Napier University. His research interests are in popular music in higher education, music education for social justice, and composition improvisation pedagogies. He's the lead editor of the Bloomsbury Handbook of Popular Music Education, Perspectives and Practices, 2019, and editor of the Routledge Research Companion to Popular Music, 2017, and an editor of Action-Based Approaches in Popular Music Education, 2021. Forthcoming books include Improvisation as a Liberatory, I nearly said that right, Praxis in Popular Music Education, and Popular Music Education for Critical Consciousness, an Anti-Capitalist Manifesto. Zack is chair of the International Society for Music Education, Popular Music Education Group, and is on the board of the directors of the Association for Popular Music Education. Zack is also an active composer and musician. Recent compositions include pieces for saxophone and tape, soul cello, and a reactive generative sound art installation for the Edinburgh International Science Festival. Zack, over to you.
And of course, I'm still muted, as I say. Thank you very much. Thanks for that. Can everyone hear me okay? Great, thank you. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. And music is the angle that I'm coming to this from, I suppose. Whilst I will be talking about music a lot, I will hopefully generalize as much as possible to higher education more widely. And actually, I think a lot of the things that I'll say, even when I use the word music, you could probably just apply the word arts in general there. So hopefully it will be as generalizable as possible. But if anyone's got any questions, I'd happily expand it as we go forward. So my contact details are there as well if anyone wants to get in touch, if anyone wants to ask questions, if anyone wants to discuss things going forward, I'd be delighted to. So, I mean, as I say, this presentation is going to be about pop music in higher education, and I'll ultimately consider elements of pedagogy and the forces and pressures that have shaped and that continue to shape our work as educators in this area. And as I say, I will make it as generalizable as possible. Before doing so, though, I want to get on to this word oppression right away. And we've heard it a few times today, and of course, we're all here for an event about Freire, so none of us will be particularly unfamiliar with this term. But I've given a presentation like this in a number of places, and I've been pulled up on the use of the term oppression a few times. So I want to just take a wee minute to say where I'm coming from. From previous experience of giving this presentation in different parts of the world, I've become really aware that people, particularly in the context of music conferences, and certainly in popular music conferences, find words like oppression jarring or perhaps even overly dramatic. Now, of course, I'm using it in the Freirean sense, but obviously it has wider connotations. There's also a real tendency in the field of popular music education, which is really new, it's only really about 30 years old or so, to, and rightly so in some ways, really celebrate the field and talk about how great it is and how amazing it is that this is a new thing and people are starting to look at that. And actually, sometimes when people come in and say, yes, but maybe there are some things that we need to look at here, that can again be jarring or can sometimes be considered negative when you bring that sort of criticality to the table. So I'm not trying to be negative here by any manner of speaking, but I am wanting to point out a few things that I think we could do better, we could do differently for the sake of developing the field and developing those who exist within the field. So is it appropriate then for us to use this highly loaded term, according to some, oppressed or oppression or even oppressors, and people tend to get more worried about that because it seems directed at people and their attitudes and behaviours, when referring to students and people studying popular music in higher education who are in global terms relatively privileged to be in this position? Now, of course, it's true to state that when Freire was writing his work, he was mainly drawing on his experiences of literacy education within groups of poor Brazilian adults. But seen in a wider context, I think the beautiful thing about his work and his writing is that his ideas are effectively dealing with consciousness raising, in fact, explicitly dealing with consciousness raising, i.e. raising people's consciousness of their own oppression and the potential barriers to their humanization. So I think this need for consciousness raising is no less important when talking about students in popular music education or the arts, or indeed in HE in general. And in some cases, though, when we think about music education, and particularly pop music education, the built-in oppression that these students face because of their specific area of study, which I'll talk about more later, the economic policies affecting their lives, and the need to develop as participants in a society increasingly dominated by a particular socioeconomic ideology. These are where the problems are, and I believe it's increasingly important for us to challenge these as educators. So I just want to take a wee minute to think about the socioeconomic context for the work, because there would be no point, and it would be, in fact, reckless to not take a minute to do this. I think it's undeniable that we're living in an age of significant inequality, in which we can see clear evidence of the widening gaps between rich and poor, to be crude about it. Not only in terms of income, but also in regard to health, education, access to public services, for instance. And actually, after decades of living under policies of austerity, many of the cuts that we're seeing are directly responsible for the increase in the prevalence of mental health issues. And indeed, many of the same issues of global capitalism can be cited as sources for a great deal of the environmental problems that our planet is facing at the moment. And I believe that this ideology and resultant political and economic policies of neoliberalism that form the core of many of the social issues that we face today are at the heart of this. But I'd like to be a wee bit more clear about my term neoliberalism, because it is one of these ones that can sometimes kind of either raise eyebrows or cause sort of derisive snorts. Because it's got a fundamental role in explaining what I believe to be the socioeconomic context for the current discussion. So this ideology, which effectively configures all aspects of existence in economic terms, to quote from Brown, clearly impacts on the way in which public institutions, for example, the NHS or schools or universities or social care services, for example, are run, with mentalities from business and market structures, values, and the ideals and incentives becoming the main guiding principles. This is argued by people like Giroux, and to quote specifically from Giroux here, neoliberalism has defined itself as a form of common sense and functions as a mode of public pedagogy that produces a template for structuring not just markets, but all aspects of social life. This is no less true in the case of schools and universities, for example, and education is becoming increasingly aligned with the values of the capitalist marketplace. And the role of these institutions is increasingly, it seems, to work to reinforce and to reproduce that dominant culture. This then is something that's particularly important to consider in the context of discussions on the ethos and the focus and the pedagogies of popular music education. And again, we can extrapolate that wider to the arts and to HE. But popular music education, I would say, is very commonly linked to notions of commercial success and marketization and entrepreneurship, which I'll talk about as we go forward. So given that we're talking about neoliberalism, I think popular music education has something of an awkward place in a neoliberalized higher education. And I think what I would say is that the problems associated with the corporatization of higher education are obviously not new. They've been written about extensively and far more eloquently than I could sum them up elsewhere, literature that many of you will be aware of. But I think few would argue that the market focus that creates students as consumers and effectively frames educators as service providers has dominated practices in colleges and universities to the extent that it greatly influences what it means to actually participate in higher education. And increasingly, it seems it's an explicit objective of higher education to equip students with the skills required to undertake employment. In this case, when talking about popular music education, this mythical kind of entity of the music industry, this kind of land where everyone works and makes music and makes money. Most institutions, in fact, offering provision in popular music and music to an extent as well, will make very, very specific and direct claims, particularly in things like prospectuses and advertising, for example, that their courses prepare students for such employment. And then they'll cite some figures about just how many of their graduates go on to achieve employment in these areas, which we all know to be somewhat vague and misleading in many cases. So popular music education finds itself in a doubly awkward position here, I would argue, because it's often seen and described explicitly as quote unquote commercial music. So the links to commerce, to industry, to the market, to preparing yourself as a product are built right in from the very outset, from the very day one when people come to start studying this. So my belief is that such a situation fosters an environment in which education takes on the role of training and functions merely as a space in which students are inculcated into a position of shallow employment-focused learning, which can often prevent the development of critical consciousness. This, to me, misses the point of higher education. And as Freire himself notes, to quote directly, if we have any serious regard for what it means to be human, the teaching of contents cannot be separated from the moral formation of learners. To educate is essentially to form. So for me, an approach to higher education in which content and skills are central at the expense of criticality is hugely problematic. For me, education should be about creating a formative culture that breeds the ideas and values of the future that we want to see, not simply a mechanism for the tacit perpetuation and rationalization of an unjust social, political, and economic reality. So this, I believe, has to start with the aim of helping students to develop a critical consciousness. And when I say that, what I really mean is the ability to recognize oppressive and dehumanizing forces in the world around them, and to be able to intervene in reality in order to change it. So that's the setup for what I'm going to do today. And in order to kind of talk about this notion of trying to get away from problematic pedagogies and move towards thinking about critical consciousness as being central to our endeavours, what I want to do is just draw on three terms that Freire brings up very frequently in his writing and in his work. Many of these appear certainly first in Pedagogy for the Oppressed, but are brought up and taken further in later writings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use each of these three terms very, very briefly to explore popular music education in higher education, and I'm going to think about how we might apply these Freirean terms or terms that Freire has used and borrowed from other people to criticise the field that we're in, with a hope that we can go forward to discuss how we can go forward with that when we come to the panel session. So what I'm going to look at is cultural invasion, false generosity, and fear of freedom. False generosity is sometimes translated as false charity, so I might slip in and out of that language, but hopefully you'll get where I'm going with that. So to look at cultural invasion, first of all, Freire states that in this phenomenon, the invaders penetrate the cultural context of another group in disrespect of the latter's potentialities. They impose their own view of the world upon those they invade and inhibit the creativity of the invaded by curbing their expression. So before we go any further, I kind of want to I guess give a bit of disclaimer, but also just think theoretically for a minute, in the same way that Louise just did about this blurring of lines between oppressor and oppressed. And I want to be very clear about the fact that I'm not setting it up as a simple dichotomy. I think we need to be mindful of the complexity of the issue, not simply move towards a facile reading in which we cast educators on one hand as oppressors and students on the other hand as the oppressed. All right, clearly this would be really overly simplistic. This would be entirely unfair to paint a picture that shows educators in this context as kind of nefarious cloaked figures that want to kind of dominate and invade and colonize the worlds of our students. But also, as we know, it's just far, far more complex than that. And actually what we need to do is think about the position of these people within the world and how they react to the world around them. We also need to be aware that students elect to study with us, I guess, in the broadest of sense. Yeah, they choose to come to us, they choose to come and study with us. So the simplistic notions of colonization, i.e. a dominant force kind of invading and controlling a distant territory, and notions of invasion and oppression that follow on from this idea don't actually seem to fit with this concept, given the apparent willingness of students to enter into this situation. But it's in this wider social context, however, that we can locate the source of oppression. And we should be clear that it's felt by students and educators alike. Okay, again, I want to reiterate that I'm not casting a kind of a simple dichotomy here. I believe that we're all oppressed by the prevailing socioeconomic condition of neoliberal policies in which we exist, and that it's particularly keenly felt within the increasingly market-focused neoliberal university. Education is one of the ways in which the ideology of this condition is perpetuated, but far worse, it's one of the situations in which this condition is normalized. Through the normalization of the ideas of the neoliberalist economic policy, oppression's led to a situation and position in which students, through their socially reinforced perception of their own inferiority, seek to be educated and trained by those who they wish to be like. And the reason they want to do that, often, certainly when you speak to students, is because they believe that being like these people who they see in powerful, experienced positions, to be like them is to give them an upper hand in gaining access into this kind of mythical music industry that people so dearly want to be a part of, it would seem. So through the perpetuation of societal norms in higher education, often celebrated under the banner of, let's say, employability or entrepreneurship or industry focus, for example, it could be argued, and only argued, that some educators become effectively the personification of such institutional oppression. And in this area, I think we should exercise a lot of caution. So again, Freire notes that for cultural invasion to succeed, okay, and this is quoting directly again from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, for cultural invasion to succeed, it's essential that those invaded become convinced of their intrinsic inferiority. And clearly in the case of popular music education, within the context of higher education, the intrinsic inferiority of our students is already built into the equation as soon as they elect to study in our institutions, for the reasons that I've noted above. So given the neoliberal context and the increase in people's perceived links between higher education study and employability potential, it could be argued that enrolling in higher education, students are clearly signaling that they're aware of their perceived inferiority. They're submitting to be taught by those more expert and more experienced than themselves. And if this isn't recognizable to some of you, then I think that's great, but certainly within the field of pop music education and often things that people perceive as being skills-based, I guess, this is absolutely the case. This master apprentice paradigm really dominates. And I think actually I see that in a lot of other areas of higher education as well. This social agreement creates a shared belief in the existence of two distinct groups, right? So on one hand, we've got the educators, and on the other hand, we've got the students. And these groups are distinguished by their relative claims to dominance. In educational terms, educators can claim dominance over their students because they're the ones that are expected to provide knowledge, to initiate learning, to quantify progress, and eventually to certify qualification. For example, in the context that we're talking about at the moment, to confer a degree, for example. How this is achieved, however, is a particular area of interest to me, and one that in the case of popular music education often leads to a particularly pervasive form of cultural invasion in which the values and the worldviews of the dominant group are imposed upon the subaltern group, even although they attend willingly in the form of students, in the hope of potential preparation for a workplace and employment within music industries. So one of the basic elements in the relationship between oppressor and oppressed is prescription. Every prescription represents the imposition of one individual's choice upon another, transforming the consciousness of the person prescribed to into one that in some way conforms with the prescriber's consciousness. So suppose we could say then that the behavior of the oppressed is a prescribed behavior, following as it does the guidelines of the oppressor. So, for example, let's have a wee think about it kind of specifically in the field of music education. Then we might consider the following to be acts of or practices that foster cultural invasion. So firstly, the continued dominance of this kind of master apprentice paradigm. That's a massive one, and we can see very clearly it's about the handing down of and being the gatekeeper and arbiter of ability and skill. And yeah, sure, it's efficient. Of course it is. It's a really efficient way to train someone to do something. But is that what we want? Is that what we want to replicate in higher education? Another one is this perpetual use of an imposition of the term music theory. And again, I'm being specific here, but you could probably apply this to your own fields. Often this is used with the definitive article. Yeah, we're talking here about the theory of music, as if there is just one. You know, like what that does is not only kind of places one thing above all else, but in some ways what it does is it negates the possibility for other ways to theorize or think about music, which is, well, that's another presentation for a different day. That's what that is. Also, another thing is repertoire-driven structuralist approaches to instrumental study and performance. You can play these works by these people because we have deemed them to be good. And incidentally, although I'm not going to go into it and I'm not going to make a cliche of it, often these people are certain types of people from certain places. And you see where I'm going with that. Hopefully that's something we can pick up later. Another thing is this kind of industry-focused employment agenda that's kind of, again, placed on people. You will, when you come and work through 4 years that we have designed to lead you to a very specific outcome, which is employment in this industry. Incidentally, though, no one ever thinks about the fact that this industry changes very, very quickly, and that degree was designed 5 years ago. So how could it be current? That's a different question, and we can talk about that later too. But also assessment practices that are based on inherently subjective, as if there is ever necessarily such a thing, based on inherently objective value judgments, as ever there's such a thing, from the judgment of those who can only ever be subjective, despite the fact that they pretend to be and present themselves as qualified and expert judges of musical ability. So I think each of these provides a really simple example of the ways in which values of the educators, either personally held or, I guess, culturally or institutionally inherited, come to be, let's say, imposed on students and influence their self-perception. In the process of such cultural invasion, the inferiority of the oppressed and their worldview is effectively reinforced. So to my mind, it's a broader context of the neo-liberalisation of the academy, the push for teleological education at all costs and clear links to industry that are the problem. And here, because of this context, because of not only the music context itself, but the context of higher education and certainly context of education in post-92 institutions a lot of the time, because of this, I would say educators are apt to become de facto colonizers, invaders, and perhaps by extension, the oppressors. Whilst I don't want to draw, as you can see on the screen, a straight line between the notion of oppressors or teachers oppressed the students, I think there is a de facto personification of the oppressor in the role of the educator in some cases because of the way that we're supposedly forced to act and behave. However, at the same time, these educators are also oppressed by the very system that they've been forced to and coerced to feed and prop up and perpetuate. Sorry, my screen's not responding. There we go. So for popular music education students and music education students in general, I suppose, the desire to succeed and to be validated by their educators manifests in a desire to assimilate to them. And Freire continues with a longer quote there, but just to pick up on the very end of it there, one pole aspires not to liberation, but to identification with the opposite pole. Again, we could draw on things like the master-apprentice paradigm as one of the obvious examples, but we should be very aware of the issues that we face when dealing with highly subjective, supposedly industry-informed assessment, evaluation, and validation of student work, because I think that is a real toxic area for us to get into if we go in blindly, and that's why I think action and reflection here are very important. So in this sense, through the forces of cultural invasion that I've talked to you about so far, we've arrived at a duality. This is to draw from Freire again directly. We've arrived at a duality in which to be is to be like. And the normalization of this attitudinal tendency to want to be like one's educators, or at least embody the values that they espouse, because this suggests a degree of success, feeds an oppressive culture in which the dehumanization and alienation of students is accepted and even desired in the quest for industry preparedness or acceptance. In such a situation of increasingly instrumental attitudes towards education, we can see quite clearly that Freire's notion of cultural invasion is appropriate here and a useful lens through which to examine and discuss conditions in the hope of potentially inspiring change. And hopefully that's something we'll be able to pick up in the panel discussion when we get there. Just doing a quick time check, so come on schedule. All right, so false generosity being the second of these three concepts. Yeah, we started thinking about cultural invasion. I want to move on to false generosity, sometimes translated as false charity. All right, so I think it would be patently wrong, and I just want to get this out right away, to suggest that higher education popular music educators are entirely oblivious to this situation, or that I'm coming to the table here with some revelation that no one else has ever noticed. Of course, that's not the case. I'm really just drawing on these ideas to look at the world around me and see how I can connect the world and the word here and see what I can do to suggest ways going forward. But I think it would also be ridiculous to suggest that people are unaware of the potential conditions for oppression that exist within our field. Many of us see the problems and we try to mitigate them through attempts to show respect and understanding for the inherently weak situation of our students. However, such attempted mitigation relates to the next of these concepts, and this is namely false generosity. To quote again directly from Freire, any attempt to soften the power of the oppressor in deference to the weakness of the oppressed almost always manifests itself in the form of false generosity. Indeed, the attempt never goes beyond this. And I guess it could be argued that such false generosity actually serves to deepen the problem, as it can serve to increase the extent to which the oppressed actually rely on and seek and crave the benevolence and generosity and charitable acts of the oppressor. The oppressors give certain things that may seem generous or may seem emancipatory on the face of things, but only so long as these things don't really kind of mess with the order and they don't interfere with the sense of dominance that structures these relationships between the two groups. And I think we need to be aware of the fact that when systems are structured in this way, some oppressors will feel honest, real, genuine compassion for the position that the oppressed find themselves in. But in attempting to assuage this sense of oppression, many will try to use their privileged positions to find ways to aid it, but without actually addressing the root of the problem. And I think on this issue, this is a nice quote here from Crowther and Martin, 2018. On this issue, we're reminded that Freire gives us a warning to be wary of the kind of false generosity that takes into account people's needs, but without understanding how these needs are caused and constructed and distributed. Freire contends that this sort of false generosity constrains the fearful and subdued, again quoting directly, the rejects of life to extend their trembling hands, but notes that true generosity, on the other hand, lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or of entire peoples, and I guess in the context that we're talking about now, we could read that as institutions and groups within institutions, need to be less and less extended in supplication so that more and more they become human hands and which work and working transform the world. And I think that's really important for us to remember. Although Freire is talking in broader terms here about his desire for a more equal society that can restore the humanity that has been eroded by the socioeconomic conditions of global capitalism, we can also use this concept to focus on oppression that is produced through conceptualizations of the educational enterprise that have been marred and tainted by this societal ubiquity of this neoliberal agenda. In a situation like that of popular music education, again, very specifically, in which educators have been tacitly granted this sort of status of master or gatekeeper, in which it seems that the explicit purpose is really to link engagement with education to access to employment in a specific industry. We've effectively created a clear division between the haves and the have-nots, the educators and the students, those who are there and those who are yet to get there, respectively. And educators are perceived to have the kind of skills and experience on one hand, students on the other hand are supposed not to, hence students come and study at the feet of their masters. In doing so though, obviously, they are assuming a deficit position and they elect to study with their masters in the hope of gaining skills that they believe are required to participate in an industry that they've been subconsciously, I guess is the word I want to use, subconsciously convinced is important to engage with. Again, to give some examples there in higher education and higher popular music education specifically, you can, oh God, isn't it terrible that we tell them what songs to play? Right, we'll not do that. We'll say they can choose from these 3 songs instead of playing this song. But again, there's still things that are proved and things that are kind of validated by someone's choice, which is why we get whole generations of people, you know, in their teens and early 20s playing music from the 70s and 80s, because that's the music that their teachers learn on and value most. And I guess what happens there is there's a lot of problems around identity, there's a lot of problems around agency, but we can talk about that more as we go forward. Also, similarly, you can choose which modules you want to take. Yes, of course you can. You can create your own pathway through this degree. See option choice, choose one of 2. You know, similar sort of thing here going on, whereby what we're saying is, yes, okay, it's important for students to be able to have agency and be able to make up their own minds, but then we engage in a sense of false generosity. We don't actually look at the structures that are pushing them in a specific direction We just take kind of superficial approaches to easing that burden slightly. Another one, though, I think, and this is an important one, is the widening participation agenda. And I don't for a minute want to suggest that I wouldn't want more people to be involved in education, because hopefully from what I've said so far, you can see that that's absolutely not where I'm coming from. But I think what happens a lot of the time in widening participation agenda situations is that universities say, okay, let's, to be kind of crude about it, let's look at the areas of multiple deprivation. Yeah, let's look at the kind of poor kids or disadvantaged kids or whatever, and see how can we get them in? How can we bring them in here? And again, I think that's a really real problem, because the assumption there is bring them to university and that'll help them change their life. And in some cases that might be the case, but of course these are people that are coming from specific social situations in which they need to understand the world that they've grown up in, not simply come to university to be inculcated into a situation that I would argue is at the root of some of the problems that are keeping these discrepancies in people's life chances going in the first place. So it is, I guess, in my mind, not enough for us to simply see the problems with the system and try to find ways around them. We as educators have got a real responsibility to raise the consciousness of our students, and indeed ourselves and our colleagues, and try to work with them in order to change the world around us and change their place in the world. This might be locally, this might be globally, but through engaging in a dialogic education practice which diminish the potential for things like cultural invasion, and through working with students, we can engage in true generosity, not false generosity, true generosity, which consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false generosity in the first place. So I know I've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to get onto the last part very quickly. In the previous two sections, I've used Freire's concepts to highlight areas of conventional practice in music education and in popular music education that I see to be problematic for a range of reasons, but primarily because of the ways in which pop music education seems so susceptible to the neoliberal agenda. As I've already talked to you about, this is partly due to its awkward relationship with commerce, and partly because it's often found in modern universities or post-92 universities in which the employability agenda is often more pervasive. And I've argued that this effectively creates a system in which conditions in which oppression can flourish, and students are effectively inculcated with a sense of their own deficiencies, and as a result our desire to be like their masters in order to gain access to this world that is being billed to them as being the pinnacle of their educational journey. In this sense, I guess what I've argued is that they're victims of cultural invasion. In fact, we're all victims of cultural invasion. And that even when the students, encounter generosity from an oppressing group or from an oppressive system, they're not necessarily free because of the inherent injustices that allow the oppressors to confer such generosity in the first place. However, this lack of freedom is somewhat complicated, though, as Freire argues and clearly acknowledges, the oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. Freedom would require them to eject this image and replace it with autonomy and responsibility. Now, I think it's really important to see what we mean by freedom in this context. What's being discussed here is the freedom to critically question the world and to change it and one's place within it. And people gain freedom through their ability to understand and change their own conditions. However, in an increasingly neo-liberalized academy, within an increasingly hostile world, where so many of our students link education to employment, this freedom can be worrying. Students are often so hell-bent on achieving and getting marks and performing better than their peers, and are therefore often scared of embracing more free and just systems of education. And some educators, on the other hand, also fear freedom because they believe that their authority or even their reason to be employed is diminished if they are not in control. This can impact on so many aspects of students' experiences and can lead to a situation in which they are oppressed into conformity. And now this can be in terms of musical style or approach to performance, etc., i.e. things that will allow them to get a job, so they're somewhat fearful of the educational freedom, that this may mean that their experiences do not allow them to be competitive in the employment market or to ensure that they have the skills to enter the market in the first place. Even if an education free from authoritarian relationships in which they have freedom to express and discover themselves could be seen as beneficial, they're reluctant to embrace this because of a fear of freedom. I'm going to finish up fairly soon because I think I'm getting close to my time here. But the point is that I think we are, in serving a dominant focus of the university through bowing to the narrative of employability and excellence and competition and commercialization, for example, effectively denying many students of the opportunity to actually become fully human, depriving them of an opportunity and simply funneling them towards and encouraging them to believe that their purpose is to serve a world that is dominated by a particular economic philosophy, and one that is, in my opinion, unjust, deeply unjust, and the reason why we have such an unfair, unequal society that sees mass disparity between the rich and the poor. In the context of music education specifically, I think that we validate and venerate an industry that is inherently exploitative, sexist, racist, and resource intensive. And we hold this as the apex of achievement in our world, in our educational world. Additionally, we create a class of precariat graduates who celebrate this as success because we fail to engage with the challenge and the root causes of the issues that lead to such a problematic and unequal society. I'm just going to skip to the end because I know that I'm a minute or so over and I apologize. But I think just to kind of get to the end here, I'm going to take 30 more seconds. I think that in a neoliberal world in which we find ourselves, oppression is a serious and insidious problem. And it's one of that's increasingly impacting on and becoming normalized through education in the way that I've described it above. For me personally, at least, I think it's really important for us to expose the contradictions we live by, to quote from Ledwith, and evolve a critical consciousness capable of transforming the unacceptable present for a future based on the common good. Now, it's not enough to just be critically conscious. We need to encourage a praxis approach to dealing with the world. Indeed, we're reminded by Freire himself that action without reflection is blind, and reflection without action is impotent. So not only do we need to get our students to be thinking critically and engaging critically in the world, but we need to think about how we can encourage and foster environments in which action is possible too. Thank you very much.